But we're very excited to be hosting two members of the packet here today. And well, thank you everyone for joining us on your Thursday evening or Thursday afternoon for What We Do with Other People, the packet. And I will get started now, and you won't miss anything important at the beginning if you haven't joined already. So I wanted to start by giving you a little introduction to Arts South Asia Project. ASAP is a UK-based arts education and development non-profit. We support initiatives to widen and deepen the engagement with modern and contemporary visual arts from South Asia and its diaspora. ASAP works with institutions and individuals, supporting selected research projects, publications, exhibitions, and events. We offer annual grants and facilitate access to wider knowledge networks in collaboration with expertise across the nations of Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka and its diaspora. We are partnering with Support Local Art. This is the third of our series about Sri Lankan art. And Support Local Art is a talk series organized by Saskia Fernando Gallery to create a much needed platform for conversation on the developments of the Sri Lankan art industry. So I'm welcoming my speakers today, Imaad and Tashi. Thank you for joining us today. Would you like to start by introducing yourselves and your relationship to the packet?
Sure, yeah. I'll go ahead and start. So my name is Tashyana Handy. I'm primarily a poet. I also work as a performance poet. But at the moment, I just graduated with a degree in international development. And I work as an illustrator and researcher. And I am one of the artists of the packet. So it's a brief introduction. Imaad, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, my name is Imaad Majeed. I'm also a poet, but my work also finds its way into other mediums. So I guess it's kind of multidisciplinary. I've been in the packet since we kind of came together. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you both. And as you've been in the packet from when it started, it's a good question to start with. How did the packet start? What are the foundations for the collective?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it was very kind of late 2018, early 2019. So at that point, there was Columbus Scope, the arts festival was going on. So there were artists who were had come down from various parts of South Asia, and we were hanging out and getting to know each other. And one of the spaces that we had to hang out was this little apartment in Valot, where Harlik, Sandev, and Venuri, all three artists, were living together. And so they would host these gatherings, and it involved obviously like putting food on the table, and like it was very participatory in the sense that we kind of, early comers would help cook, and like as people started trickling in, someone has to play music, this and that, just, hanging out. And through those conversations, because, well, not everyone were artists, but we would wind up talking about the art scene and how we were kind of navigating it. And some of the things that came up that we kind of shared were our feelings about this kind of relationship with institutions, in the sense of how we felt that our practices were constantly kind of being steered around, in a sense, or trying to kind of respond to curatorial prompts and like these larger discourses and such. And we were kind of wanting a space to be able to really create what we felt like creating. And then came this question of, what if we worked together, since we share this kind of feelings, and what would we create together? And that's kind of the space from which, through these gatherings over a few months, that we decided to make this thing that eventually became the packet.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add on that, Tashi? I know you weren't there at the beginning, but you've joined.
Yeah, I think I'll keep my thoughts for now, because I wasn't there at the beginning. So
Yeah, of course. So I think that's an interesting question for you, actually, Tashi, about the importance of Fred Moten's the paraphrased quote that you've used of what we do with other people for the packet.
yeah, that's actually a great second question, because my formal introduction to the packet was Fred Morton's notion of what we do with other people. So yes, as you can think you'd be able to tell from this. Yeah, so I kind of joined the packet purely as an administrator initially. When the packet somewhere in 2020, I think, launched a residency with a few artists called Instigating Collaborative Study. And when I first heard about it, I didn't want anything to do with it. I wanted to run in the other direction, only because I have a lot of family and friends who are very much involved in the packet. But I think it was like one of the members of the packet who approached me and was like, would you like to consider applying for this internship? And at the time I was a broke uni student, so any support was support. So I said, great, yeah, okay, let's consider this. So I applied, and I remember the first meeting that we had. They were talking about one of the essential of the introductory readings, which was Fred Morton's series of essays called The Undercommons. And in it, he refers to this notion of what we do with other people, and he refers to it as study. And so for me, that was a very kind of foreign idea as to, no, what we do with other people is just what we do with other people. We can't refer to it as study, right? It's not intellectual in that sense. But I think this notion of constantly interacting with each other, whether it be cooking together, eating together, having conversations, going on walks, just being together in spaces of or modes of activity, and referring to that as study, because it also provides alternative ways of inquiry, alternative ways of just sharing knowledge with each other in these different settings that aren't very structured. And so for me, that was quite interesting and like very enlightening in a lot of ways. And that was my first introduction to the packet. And I think it stems also from the origin story of the packet that Imaad referred to, where it was in this tiny apartment in Vadavata, where everyone was just coming over to eat and cook and clean together. And I think from that experience is when we were able to really share different ideas and thoughts and projects, and just kind of being this constant state of rehearsal with no structured outcome in mind. Yeah, I think that kind of slightly sums it up, I guess.
You mentioned ICS, and we have a picture of ICS. It would be really helpful to maybe elaborate a little bit more on your work on this project.
Sure. So ICS was basically a residency between 14 different artists in Colombo, but also artists in Sri Lanka. It was based in Colombo, I think, if I remember correctly, from around September, October 2020 to November. And it was a really kind of interesting process of bringing in artists from different fields. So we have researchers and writers and filmmakers and activists and architects and poets, all in the same space, kind of interacting and conversing with each other over a period of a few months. And so, yeah, so that was ICS. And yeah, that's just a brief.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Imaad, did you want to add anything on that?
No.
You're good? Okay, perfect. I will go over to a question for you next then. So from the working title of a publication, how did the conditions of the pandemic cultivate collaborative study as the packet?
Yeah. So what's interesting is we started our initial project early 2019, and it was this idea of a kind of deconstructed art book, and we thought of like what could possibly like hold these different like little zines that we each would make, exploring like these little niche interests of ours. And that's kind of where the title of the packet came from. We thought of using, the kind of um, reused paper waste that turns into these packets for like chana, like kadala, as we call it, and stuff. And as we were working on that, we wanted to like crowdfund and be independent and distribute in that way. But then we had the Easter Sunday attacks in April of that year, and then we realized, oh, we probably can't be crowdfunding an art thing right now. And so it kind of, the progress of like creating got elongated, and then we were kind of living through this emergency rule sort of emergency regulations period, and then eventually COVID hits, and we're in a lockdown. And at that point, actually, another publication kind of came into being, but it was very much just kind of serendipitous in the sense that we were continuing to be in touch with each other over this app called House Party. And we would like play games with each other and just, check in. And we were also writing to each other. And then we were invited by the Goethe to kind of respond to what this means, what does this global pandemic mean? And that's the point at which we were like, hey, we don't want to like come into this in that, serious artist, thinker, kind of theorize your way around calamity kind of way. And we wanted instead to explore the more intimate nature of the conversations we were having. And so we were all on this email thread, writing to each other from these little micro moments of what we were experiencing. And then that eventually became this publication called Letter Suffering, which actually ended up being made even before the original Packet publication came out. So it was, the longer title is Letters Suffering, and more about suffering from the incessant hot takes, and kind of resisting that and going towards more of the intimate, more of the lived experience. But yeah, interestingly, maybe Tashi can talk a bit more about how the pandemic affected ICS as well, because it was meant to be a physically present kind of residency. And then we had these kind of lockdowns we couldn't predict. And yeah, Tashi, do you want to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, sure.
Pivot?
Yeah. So ICS was interesting because it was based off of constantly being in conversation and interaction with each other. And then when lockdowns hit and then emergency situation also hit at the same time, that those opportunities became very scarce and kind of distributed. And we didn't really know if it was appropriate to, to meet in person as well. And so I think after quite a few conversations and a series of meetings between all 14 artists, I remember we collectively, we decided to move this interaction online. And so what you see in front of you is basically an email thread, or the beginning of an email thread. And how it works is that there were 14 email threads between 14 different artists. And so each artist would start their email thread and send it to another artist. And every 48 hours, each artist was supposed to respond to their email. So every 2 days, you would have to respond to an email, but you would also receive an email in your inbox. So it was very interesting because there was a lot of kind of how do you say, uneven kind of experimental conversation happening. because I think with everyone's capacities and everybody's ability to respond within 48 hours, it really kind of showed. And it was very exciting because there were multiple threads, multiple nodes of engagement that we were constantly having to pick up on. Sometimes, of course, the 14 email threads, so it's a little chaotic, and sometimes one thread would get stuck and you have to trace where the backlog is, and then we'd figure that out and move on. And it was a constant back and forth. But what was really incredible about this is that each email thread has its own kind of personality, I call it. There's multiple areas of interest, multiple prompts, multiple things that people have latched onto, but also different points of vulnerability as well. So I think this is Iman's thread, where she starts off including this poem, and then tearfully and dehydrated to Iman. So everyone kind of signed off, or they moved on. I think there's few other slides. Yes. So sometimes when you didn't have the capacity to respond, you could pass the email on. So that's moving those response there. And then of course you also had very heavy conversations happening as well. I think this was a response to a email thread that started, I think, with Sharika, who talked about when did the war begin, and this idea of beginnings and endings. And there was a lot there. It was a very broad conversation. So what happened was, towards the end of this, I think we decided that we were going to put this in like a few zines, and I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, so it's called Mathematics. And it's basically a collection of these email threads that happen between the course of 2 months. And mathematics is we decided to call it mathematics because we were trying to figure out there's so much math involved in this whole process. And one of the artists, Iman, she mentioned that this kind of it reminds her of what the math teacher used to say, which is, it doesn't matter what your answer is as long as you show me the workings. So kind of just mapping out this whole process rather than focusing on an intended outcome. And I think, yeah, it was such a great experience. I think, especially like with the support from Helvetica, and it was something that was my first introduction to the packet, and it was very great to be able to shift from in-person interaction to also online during COVID as well. So yeah,
there's such a strong sense of community around you all. That caring moments as well through email, and you weren't together, but you were still able to have that feeling of being together.
Yeah, and ultimately I think it was only in January or so, or maybe even February, that we finally got to come together again and spend a weekend like sitting with all the emails, putting them into PDFs, and like by hand, like spray painting them and like packaging them and stuff. So yeah, it is great that ultimately we did get to bring the whole group together again and like cook our meals and all of that. So yeah, it was quite an experience also in kind of expanding, the group of people that we were working with, and inviting people into this way of studying. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm hoping that I'll be able to see this book these zines one day, fingers crossed. But what would be really interesting, and you've said it quite a lot as a word to describe how the packet works, is what does it mean to be hyperlocal, not only in Sri Lanka, but also in the wider South Asia?
Um,
I'll skip. Yeah, this is the one, isn't
it? Yeah, that's a great. So this is an extract from one of the zine threads. I think Rupanathan sent us, and it's a public heart in its blood circulation. And referring to the question of hyperlocality, that was slightly a foreign like at least the term was foreign to me.
Mm.
I think I remember my first kind of realization of this idea was when the packet was doing a workshop at Serendipity, and the task was that each of us had to dive into our personal archives, so either photographs or memes or anything that we've screenshotted, like the silly little archive that we have. And we had to basically, there's a photograph as a prompt, and then each of us had to respond to that photograph with whatever that we had in our archives. And there was constant, you could see that there was conversations between these images. But what was really interesting to me was that there were things that were hyper specific to our experience, either as like Sri Lankans or based on our identity or background or whatever it was. And there were things that were universally understood. And I think when we consider this idea of hyperlocality, especially from like being in Sri Lanka or being in South Asia, I think as the packet, we try to engage with it or balance it out in terms of how much of what we do we need to explain to other people, but how much of it are we allowed to explore on our own terms? And I think that's a really interesting idea to kind of toy with and play with a little bit, because a lot of the time as artists or as practitioners, we have to sometimes over explain ourselves. And I think resisting the urge to do that is something that I would consider as being hyperlocal. I think that's also, it's very evident in terms of how the packet works online with its the Instagram account, but also, yeah, the packet radio. Imaad, do you want to maybe share about that?
Yeah, this was packet radio was totally like a form that just kind of manifested because I think I was supposed to do an Instagram live. We were doing a takeover of this Instagram page called southasia.art. And that was pretty good for us because it kind of gave us an audience that was interested in South Asia and kind of diasporic in a sense. And we were each packet member was supposed to do like some kind of IG live thing. So Sandev and Venuri did like this conversation about Julieta Singh's No Archive Will Restore You. And then I was trying to figure out how I could go live on Instagram without my phone. And then I learned how to do it through my laptop. And then the streaming software, I started like playing with it and realized that, oh, there's like maybe ways to play with this. And essentially the first packet radio was not even like called that in a sense. And it was just pulling together random, not really random, but more to what Tashi was saying, just specific visuals and then pairing it with music. And the music also tended to be like golden era, like 60s folk pop in Tamil and in Sinhala, and then bringing in these different like just independence era, like still quite colonial imagery, and playing with it, adding text onto it. And I think that's where our phrase "don't theorize, just realize" came in for the first time as well. And what was cool about what happened with Packet Radio was that the chat room, because Instagram Live has a chat room, became so active and so specific, like people picking up on like the visual cue or like the references, and there's like this distinct hyperlocality in terms of being able to get it right and relate to it and then have a conversation about it and laugh about it in the chat. So since then we've kind of refined the format a little. We still experiment with it, and yeah, it's just a really fun way to just play with media and our relationships with these things. Yeah.
I guess it's interesting to kind of think back about this like ability to be hyperlocal through your Instagram and through radio, but also when we had a first conversation, you spoke about the packet and that metaphor being something that allows you to be hyperlocal as well. So it'd be really interesting for you guys to bring whoever wants to to kind of talk through that a bit more.
If you go back 2 slides.
There we go.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think of packaging as a metaphor in the sense of like how if like a common frustration among audiences and artists as well is like how much of the art world is kind of dealing with a lot of jargon, dealing with a lot of art speak. People feel kind of alienated because they don't quite understand what this string of words really means. And I feel like we're constantly needing to kind of label things, and being contained by them. And in a sense, I think Harlik once put it really well. And Tashi was kind of saying something along those lines as well. Why is it that as South Asian artists, we need to constantly like add all this metadata, all this labeling, just for our voice to be worth hearing, or for the work that we're creating to like be of some interest or value? Why can't we speak from these very intimate and messy places that we're in? And I just love this particular image, this Beyond Benign Brothers and a hot and spicy mixture. I feel like it's it speaks well to like yeah, that sense of that metaphor at least. Yeah.
And were there other exhibitions that you felt that this like container process and not being a real, you're a non-container essentially, and you're able to bypass these hopefully bypass these flattening labels, but are there any other shows that you've worked on that that kind of express that?
Yeah, so interestingly, thinking about the non-container, how Ursula Le Guin speaks of it, like I feel like what's interesting about the way we work is that even the collective in itself is not really a container as such. It's really amorphous. It's quite porous. There's different points at which members drop in, drop out, tune in, tune out. And like, it's really about the conversation and what you're resonating with. So if we get an opportunity, to work with some curators and we have these conversations and we're kind of thinking through it together, we never really start with like what outcome and what form it's going to take. We kind of check in on where each of us are at thematically, what we're interested in, and if the project can kind of hold space for that. And I think that's the point at which the form really arrives to like contain these different things. So there's a slide here where you see a dot matrix printer. Here. So this is an example of something where there's so much conversation before the form arrived, right? There's about 5-6 artists here, and each of us have created a kind of zine exploring a very particular intimate moment in our lives. So you have this printer, this dot matrix printer, sitting in this exhibition space, sharing space with other works. And it's working on multiple levels. One is spatially, it's spewing out these the paper and like creating this mound into the space and generating more and more into the space, but also emitting sound that's kind of bouncing off the walls and kind of present in a certain way. And yeah, I mean, the the stories itself that we were speaking about, like Sandev's contribution to this is about a kind of uncomfortable physically and emotionally van ride that he's taking with some boys from his batch in school. And they're, it's the usual bravado, singing like these songs with slight vulgarities that are, slightly problematic and such. And then the van is also like uh, having trouble going up this hill, and like they don't know if they're going to make it in time. So he just took pictures the whole time to kind of like escape everything else,
Yeah.
and all the masculinity is present. And so when you watch the print of feeding it out, you just see this sort of like film of like motion of what the view outside the window is. And then you have text kind of detailing the conversations that the dialogue that Sandhil's kind of remembering. So like that, like um, the kind of linearity of the printer printing out as well creates like a really interesting thing. So yeah, that was an interesting experience in which uh, we found ways to contain things. And if you go a little further,
Yeah. This one?
um, so right. Tashi, do you want to speak about OMR?
Sure. So OMR was actually a very just an fun display that came up with, I think, at the end of last year, first the Serendipity Festival in Goa. So what it was, how it originated was between two different projects. So one was Talk to You Soon, Talk to You Later, and then for Future Landing. And then the other was the Escape Artist, which you might have seen previous slides. And it's basically both are kind of toying, both are kind of toying with this idea of dissociation in a lot of ways from online, using online Instagram accounts or interactions to really dissociate from our current moment in time. And so the Office of Mass Resignation was interesting because so you see again the dot matrix printer, and there were multiple kind of ideas being thrown around at one point, but eventually we came up with this concept of what if there was a government office that was whose function was purely to process resignations en masse, and what would that look like? And so even when we were talking about this and kind of trying to figure out, what it was we could, or how we could bring this to life, you see the little, the logo at the back there. I think Kitty came up with the little, what is it, the crystal ball and the Prospectors logo. And then we see all of this kind of setup and what an office would look like, just sharing from each other's experience of going into a government office and having to really painstakingly put down information and not really kind of surrendering to this invisible bureaucracy that operates on whether there are people in the office or not. And so the office explores that idea, but if you look at it, you could see that the office is quite empty. And so the story behind this office is that at some point while they were processing these resignations, the staff themselves begin one by one to resign and leave the space. And all of a sudden, the machinery of the office, however, still keeps running. And it's just this idea of kind of really surrendering to the invisible algorithm of bureaucracy or whatever it is, and hoping at the end of the day that you will be able to get a free pass or get something that will help to navigate your life better. So the idea here, to be specific, is that person can come in and file their complaint and then put it in the ballot, and at the end of it, the office would process it and will let them know if their their application to resign is accepted or rejected. So if it's accepted, you get a self-care quote, and if it's rejected, you get a billionaire hustler's quote. So just kind of, putting this together, but it required everyone who, in different ways and forms, and whatever they have to offer. So I think this, in all of the installations and the projects we do, the way that the packet works is that, like Imaad mentioned, depending on, what idea resonates with you and what you are able to contribute and the capacity at which you're able to contribute, people, take on different roles. And it's a constantly shifting process, which provides a lot more elasticity if it was rigid and there's not a lot of room for play. So in this case, we were really able to just explore these ideas and really go wild with a few of them, which is a lot of fun. And yeah, I think the way that the packet functions in this way kind of allows us to do a lot of things.
And this playful nature, which comes into you refusing to theorize, essentially, realize, not theorize. Is that, am I saying it right? Let me you want to realize. Refusing to theorize is like really kind of shows up so strongly on your Instagram, which I know is like many people's entrance point to the packet. It would be really helpful to kind of just think through or kind of understand your use of Instagram as a platform. I know you've briefly mentioned it, but just how you share conversations on it and how you resist containership and flattening through Instagram.
Yeah. So if you go back a bit, I think there's yeah, okay. So yeah, this is an example of the kind of stories that we put up. So this is actually from the ICS program when we invited members of the group itself to do takeovers. And it was interesting how some of them kind of caught on a bit to some of the, I guess, feel of our stories, which is strange. But each of them had like very distinct personalities too, in terms of what they shared. But the story of the Instagram was actually, so while we were working on the original publication, we were like, okay, we need an audience, right? We need to get people interested. So let's start an Instagram account. And for now, we don't have this thing ready yet, but eventually we'll have some kind of audience. We'll crowdfund through that, But since that wasn't happening and things were slowing down, we had decided at the get-go that we're just going to shitpost, just put up whatever. And so we started doing that. And with no sense of like aesthetic direction or like forms, none of that. But what we started to realize was, because you're also following. So from my account, I'm following the packet, and then the packet shows up, and I watch the stories, and it's like 5-6 different stories, and they're so different, and yet they feel weirdly resonant in some sense. And then you kind of, so I'm seeing some kind of connection, so I add something in as well to kind of like further that conversation. And that kind of became a process in a sense of like, oh, I'm not sure about sharing this on my profile because people are going to, kind of look at me for that, what I'm expressing. So here's like a little space where I can just like put all this stuff out. So yeah, it's in a strange way, it kind of like revealed a process to us of like just being a little freer. I think maybe but maybe Tashi can speak to it a bit as well, because you got to see it from the outside first as well. Yeah.
Yeah. My initial reaction was, I don't know what's going on, but then my eventual reaction was, oh, I don't think they do either. Because I think the question that I get the most is like, who is the packet? like who is posting all of these things? And at the end of the day, you really don't know, because whoever kind of has access to the account just kind of posts, and then sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's multiple people just being in conversation with each other. And I think that that's really interesting, because there's this sense of, it's shrouded in the sense of mystery, but and yet like the sense of anonymity, but at the same time you do know that there is a presence behind this account, behind, you know, these stories. So it's really interesting for me, because I mean, I think I keep going back to this idea of play, because when we think of different platforms, there's always this kind of fear of your digital footprint being a mark, and that really can be a little crippling, because it doesn't allow you to say some of the things that you kind of want to, but you know, might be tied in with your identity later on, all of that. But I think the sense of anonymity, but also playfulness the packet is just kind of being consumed by, really allows you to explore things and, you know, have fun with a little few things. And especially with the packet stories, because it's 24 hours, and Instagram, I mean, the platform itself, I think allows you to be a little to approach things in a way that's inconsequential. So it's 24 hours, it's up there, and then it might be drowned in like 110 other different stories from the packet, or it might not. It might stay there as the singular thing for the next 24 hours. But it's just this idea of, you know, being able to explore and to say something, but still to just kind of like be behind the curtain as well. Yeah.
It really seems like you guys have so much fun with everything you're working on. And obviously you've shared a few of the projects that you've worked on recently. It would be, I mean, I can tell you guys are very important, because every time we talk to anyone in our like conversations at ASAP, the packet comes up and everyone's like, we're working with the packet, and we are. So you guys are doing such important work at the moment, but I'd love to kind of understand, what are you doing now? What are your plans for the future? And how do you see the packet? How does the packet continue?
Yeah, I think what's important to us is to continue to learn from each other, keep exchanging ideas, thoughts, how we're feeling, and like continue that, and like kind of holding space for that. And yeah, I guess creating spaces for this is kind of rare in the local art scene, in a sense. I mean, we're trying to kind of hold space that's not necessarily institutional, to kind of practice and think about art, and also to kind of be aware, in a sense, or be responsive to the time and context and the place that we are in, you know. uh Tashi?
Yeah, I think yeah, a lot of kind of in line with what Imaad has been saying. For us, I feel like there's a resistance to this need to propel ourselves into the future, because a lot of the kind of the work that we do is very responsive, and it's very trying to understand what it is that we are feeling, thinking, and grappling with in a moment in time. And so I think when we think of the projects that we work on, or we want to work on, it's always, we will kind of get to that position once we come to it. Because a lot of the work that we do, again, like I think we think about things retrospectively. And so it's mostly about just responding to the immediacy of our current context. And again, with the work that we're currently doing, even so, I think if you go a few slides before, so one slide. Okay, yes, this one. So workshops like Read the Reading Room, which is a zine workshop, and kind of opening up the Packet Zine archive to be able for other people to join in and kind of get to know about our practice, but also be able to join into that conversation. And so this is one of the workshops that the Read the Reading Rooms that we kind of had recently. And that kind of ties, I think, if you go to the next slide, ties into mostly just opening up our practice for everyone who is willing or who wants to know about it or who wants to join in. So these are fusing workshops that I kind of had at AOD with a few students, few design students, and just introducing them again to the archive that we have, spreading as much resources as possible, really trying to think out loud in many ways and think out in public, but also question in public. So yeah, there's a few things that we hold important to us in terms of just getting involved in responding to our current space, but a lot of it is really just kind of fumbling in the dark, but we're all fumbling in the dark together, so it's like a little game. But it's yeah, I think it's just kind of trying to be in a moment and be able to engage with it as much as possible.
Yeah, and I feel like so the zine archive is actually pretty important to us. We've been able to gather zines from other practitioners in South Asia, like Exhausted Geographies, Scroll Projects. I have some Party Office and like things like that. It's really interesting to see how we have these zine making as a practice, and publishing, I think, is a great way to kind of get a sense of what's going on, not just in South Asia, but more broadly as well. And yeah, I guess goal-wise, it would be good to be able to find a space for the zine archive. Right now, it's in a house where a few of us live, but you know, it's pretty precarious in Sri Lanka right now. So you never know when your landlord is going to be like, "Oh, time to get up and get going." So it would be, yeah, one goal would be to safely house the scene archive, and also for us to continue to be more independent, and to continue to be able to hold space for this kind of um, working together. And yeah, um, hope we can hope that that works out for us. But yeah,
I guess this all comes into the resisting notion, and
yeah,
you and it's quite nice, probably a feeling to have that you're getting more and more opportunities, so you can just be like, this is what we want to do, and make and pick and choose in a way.
yeah.
Well, I unless you guys have anything else to add on that, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. And thank you both so much for being so generous with telling us all about the work, such important work the Packet's been doing. I'm just going to see if I can stop share. And if you have any questions, there is a Q&A box which you can put in, and I will speak to them. And let you guys have a breather. You've been speaking a long time. And if we're waiting for questions, I know you're both have mentioned that you're poets, but also work in lots of different medium. We can I'd love to kind of know, as well as being part of the collective, how does being part of the collective really reflect on your individual art practice for both of you? Who's raising his hand?
Okay, I feel like Imaad is giving me the eyebrows. So I think for me, the most obvious would be that it's really helped get over the sense of the imposter syndrome in a lot of ways. because working in a collective, like I think you mentioned, you're quite literally thinking out loud, and so it's difficult to get stuck because you have a lot of feedback from people working in different fields and come from different experiences and different areas of expertise, and so it's this constant state of motion, which really helps because when you have an idea and you are trying to kind of work around it, and working in a collective basically allows you to invite somebody into that idea or open it up for the entire collective. And if it works if it works, great. If it doesn't, you can ditch the idea or you can invite somebody else into the space and kind of move on. So it really helps because sometimes collaboration can be a little difficult and sometimes it can be a little disastrous, and that can make you, can paralyze you a little bit. But I think this way, because you're in a constant state of motion, it doesn't, you're not stuck. So that's been very helpful, especially in terms of just, being in conversation. That's kind of being helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like there's so many ways in which it kind of becomes a support system as well, because you now know all these people who are kind of can relate to the struggle of trying to, be an artist, especially in a Sri Lankan context where there isn't a whole lot of infrastructure and not yet a developed enough ecosystem for it, right? So there's definitely that, but also for me, this idea of the rushing, because I used to really rely on like these kind of bouts of inspiration, and especially with my poetry, like I would write in one like inspired moment and hardly ever edit it and whatnot. And even with some of the other avenues it would take, there was very much a reliance on that kind of stimuli. Whereas since working with the packet and learning about other approaches, I've learned how to really slow down and really kind of gather material. The work that I do now is more about gathering archives in a sense that are specific to these questions that I'm exploring, that are still like coming from more poetic impulses, but I've kind of learned through other people's practices, how to kind of pace things in a sense. So yeah, that's something that's been really valuable for me for my own practice.
Thank you. We have lots of questions now, all very good questions actually. The first question is, how do you balance speaking to the hyperlocal when that may be perhaps a similar discourse and mechanism of nationalism, or are those two things at odds with each other? Good question.
I feel like even when we're thinking about containers, I feel like in a sense, does the container not reproduce the violence of the structures you already live in? I feel like in a sense, no, I don't think we're talking about necessarily I'm trying to like fully grasp this question. Can you repeat it again?
Yeah, of course. So how do you balance speaking to the hyperlocal when that may be perhaps a similar discourse and mechanism of nationalism, or are those two things at odds with each other?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's a bit...
Firstly, we try not to speak to. We try to practice speaking from. And I think it's kind of dangerous terrain to associate that as somehow being inevitably nationalistic, because I mean, something that I realized very early on with this group of artists as well is that we each feel somewhat alienated from uh, the nation state, perhaps our religious background. And so I think it's important for us to, man, such a intense question. But I feel like, I don't know, I don't feel that any of us necessarily um, are pushing like a nationalism as such, where we all like artists who are kind of struggling with that sense, like you're constantly tagged as a Sri Lankan artist as such. It's more so like, why not just look at this person as an artist speaking from a very particular lived experience who might be at odds with those larger structures that are pretty violent and that are pretty restricting. So I would turn that question around and say, like, by insisting that this person is a Sri Lankan artist and therefore is in some way doing the work of the state, I think that is where the balance is. Uh, it's not from uh, the hyperlocal approach. Yeah.
Great.
Sorry, I took a while with that.
It was a scary big question. Well, two more questions. One is scary and one is less scary. The first
Okay,
one,
let's go with
which one do you want first?
less scary first.
Less
Yeah.
scary. So this is an easier one. So this is from Ephraim, who are some writers or authors the packet is reading or thinking through right now? It's a nice question.
Imaad, do you want to think of it?
Oh, but I just did the eyebrows. That's your cue.
I think, well, I haven't actually spoken to the rest of the packet recently, which is the thing. But at least as a member of the packet, I could say I'm rereading Fred Martin's The Undercommons, and actually kind of going back to the ICS work because I stumbled on it very recently. It's quite excited. So it's Fred Morton's The Undercommons, Julieta Singh's No Archive of a Story, and also a lot of nonfiction. So that is a lot of Sri Lankan nonfiction authors. So that is who I am personally reading at the moment. But Imaad, do you want to
Yeah.
explore?
So most of my reading is actually nonfiction and in the form of ebooks that people, in the undercommons share with each other. But in terms of physicals, my mother helps me read this. I was never taught how to read Tamil, but my mom reads Tamil. This is a compilation my grandaunt put together of folk songs of the Muslims of Sri Lanka. So I have a project that kind of draws from this as an archive. Also stole this from a feminist library. I will return it when I finish it, maybe. This is Technical Difficulties by June Jordan, one of my favorite poets, but I hadn't read her essays before. Really, really quite inspiring and interesting to read through. As a poet, like I draw a lot of inspiration, particularly from her voice. And then quite a few people that I really look up to have been recommending Freshwater. It's really absorbing read, really interesting use of pronouns by Akweki Emezi. So those are kind of the books that I'm either working with or constantly dipping in and out of.
Thank you for sharing. I was writing down the the names. I love sharing. But
Also, our
Packet
group
is
chat, people are saying Too Hot to Handle on Netflix is something that we're watching.
which I think is such a great recommendation.
it's such a great show.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have
I
time
think
for
the
oh, sorry.
packet is, yeah, I think the packet is also trying to organize a Barbenheimer as well.
Nice.
Gotta
Yes.
keep up with the cinematic zeitgeist, I guess. But yeah.
I'm hoping I see a Barbie post on the packet soon on the Instagram. We have 3 more questions, but I don't know how much more time we'll have. So I will at least do one, which was so I gave you a lovely question. Now this is a bigger question. How do you balance the reality of being reliant on institutional funding and working with institutions and the need to also preserve your independence and autonomy as a collective? Who's raising their eyebrow? Oh, he raised his eyebrow.
I think
to
Tashi
it
raised
every
her.
time.
You were
Yeah.
like suggesting raising the eyebrow. Okay, I guess I'll try to answer this really quickly. I think there's a certain, because recently someone at like a discussion about music of the Muslims in Sri Lanka, someone pointed at me and was like, this person works for an institution. You can't be a true artist if you work for an institution, as though somehow that completely invalidates what I do. And they were just speaking about my individual practice. And so I've thought about this, not just because of that provocation, but I think as you're navigating, you have to deal with it. But I think in Sri Lanka, there's a certain privilege in terms of what damn it community you're part of, and like your ability to create alternative spaces. You have in the history of the art scene here, you have quite a few, still a few, but you have more independent kind of collectives that have come together, but they tend to be mostly Sinhalese and not necessarily spaces that people from other communities necessarily feel comfortable working with. And so, and some of them are able to put on entire independent sort of festivals as well. And I think if you come from a minority community, or if you um, are in certain ways marginalized, you kind of rely on it. I mean, if you look at like LGBTIQA artists, there hasn't been a lot of space for that. It's only more recently that the Jaffna Queer Festival has come into existence and has a very clear focus on how they want to slowly kind of work towards platforming artists. And yeah, I feel like this is so much of a question you ought to be asking of like a far more developed infrastructure. Like institutions are something fairly new here. And yes, it's important to be kind of wary of how it steers things. But at the same time, you have to be kind of sensitive to like, why aren't there necessarily resources for artists to be entirely independent of it? So I think it's something that you kind of have to grapple with and figure out in which ways it might compromise you or in which ways it might strengthen you. So yeah.
To add on to that, I think that going back to kind of the conversation of what we hope to be as a collective in the future, just to like to cultivate that co-function, but also realizing how like we work in terms of registering our own personal capacities, and if this is work that we can afford to do at this point in time, and how will that happen? And I think that reliance there feels like a strong word, but I think that taking note of those um, those nodes of how we function also helps to kind of, I would say, yeah, I'd say grapple with having to work through certain institutions sometimes, but also just kind of constantly reverting to how do we want to respond to this and what are our capacities at present. And if those capacities aren't in line with how we'd like to cultivate that core function of being independent, then maybe we'll kind of reconsider it. So yeah, I think it kind of comes back to that, those questions of flux of response. But yeah.
Yeah. So I wasn't laughing at what Tashi was saying. I was laughing because I looked at the Packard group chat and we're playing a drinking game where if either me or Tashi says the word community, you have to have a shot of arak. And I managed so well, and I just had to like say it eventually. So yeah.
I like it. I feel like they're all there, all the packets there behind you. You're representing them, their voices are coming through the WhatsApp chat.
Yeah.
So let's do the last two questions and then we will call it a night because it's quite late for all of you in Sri Lanka and wherever else you are in the world. So the penultimate question is, can you tell us a bit more about how imposter syndrome settles in when pursuing art of your chosen forms? How do you break away from the singularity of feeling out of place when chasing after yourself? It's a very lovely written question. Tash, do you want to start? You mentioned imposter syndrome.
Sure. I think for me, it became a bit of an issue because I started as a poet probably when I was quite young. At the time, there was this conversation of like, oh, at least internal conversation of, is your work actually good, or is it good in relation to your age or your experience? But also, while that was happening, there was this kind of idea that worked in tandem that in Sri Lanka, or at least Colombo, you come from, there's either a class or a group of people whose English is very good. And I wrote primarily in English. And I think for me, I also speak in English most of the time, but it's just this identity of not really belonging to that group and being unable to have those same kind of experiences and exposure to certain opportunities that really kind of made me second guess if I was able to do what I want, like do what I was doing at the time. And so for me, I think that's why this notion of learning in alternative modes, like in conversation in community. Okay, sorry. Was really helpful because it recontextualized things into being able to learn outside of these structures. So that was helpful for me. But again, yeah, I think it settled only because sometimes a lot of us see ourselves as outsiders from these specific spaces. We could be complete insiders in other spaces. But I think just that experience of not having the same upbringing or background. There's a lot of people who are legends in specific fields can be very daunting. I think that just being able to put yourself out there and go talk to somebody else who might have the same interest as you is a very it's a very kind of freeing experience, liberating experience, I guess. So yeah, I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but yes.
I definitely think it does. I'm not going to open it up to Imaad because we have one more question. Imaad can have the last one. So the last question is, do you ever have conflict within the collective, and how do you manage sharing responsibilities and organizing duties?
This question definitely came from someone in the collective. I think that's, yeah. I think it does. I think the nature of collaboration is that you will have um, times where you can't always choose the path of least resistance, because at that point, no one's really taking risk anymore. And I think sometimes the work that really kind of pushes you and makes you feel like you've done something is when there's risk. And so I think that's something that you kind of negotiate as you are, in these kind of spaces of conflict, sometimes you kind of find ways to um, I don't want to go on for too long about this, but yeah, I mean, conflict does happen. Sometimes, someone might be slacking off a bit. And so one person in the collective kind of needs to be there, just like prodding a bit. And like, Tashi was our chief packaging officer. That was the title we gave her during ICS, and kind of kept things in line. Harlik has played that role in the past as well. Right now, we've got the incredible, really lovely Mayan kind of spearheading some of the work we're doing now. So, yeah, I think it takes quite a bit of patience also when you're working with a larger group. So, ultimately, I think because it's not just two people kind of struggling on one project, and it's a bit more diffuse, you can always, if you're feeling like the conflict is leaving you a little bruised, you can speak to someone else. They can kind of give you a bit of perspective. The person is doing the same, and then things kind of slowly resolve, I think. So yeah.
Thanks. Well, it's good. No one ever takes the leadership role, but it's nice that someone always takes that packaging officer role. So,
Yeah.
well, we have been so grateful to have both of you and the WhatsApp group on our Zoom talk today. So thank you hugely to Tashi and Imaad, and to the packet on the WhatsApp group. And also huge thank you to Saskia, Fernando Gallery, and Harshi for facilitating everything and making this so easy. And finally, huge thank you to the Faisal and Shabana Foundation, without whom we would not be able to do the series. So everything of all three talks will be up to or online, and then this one will be online shortly. And thank you everyone for joining us, and have a lovely evening.